Hello and welcome to Roll for Topic, a roundtable discussion about topics related to running role-playing games. I'm Chris Salzman, and this week I am joined by Toby. Toby, you can say hi.
Hi, I'm Toby.
Welcome on the podcast. Toby's been on before. I invited Toby here to specifically talk about dice and math and stuff, stuff like that. And the reason that Toby is really like the right person to ask for this is because you actually have a PhD in mathematics. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yeah, I do.
Okay. Yeah.
But I will say I am not a probabilist, which is the
Okay.
coolest word to say. Uh,
Yes.
but it is what people who study probability formally call themselves, which is just silly and fun.
Really? Okay. So is that a okay? We're immediately getting kind of off topic here, but that's okay. So if you're a probabilist, prob,
Probabilist.
probabilist, if you're a probabilist, is that like all you do? Like, can math get that sort of like niche as you get into it? Like, okay, so
Absolutely.
you're
Yeah,
nodding. Okay,
absolutely.
yeah,
So
yeah.
so just for some context, my focus was in geometry and the
Mm.
shapes of leaves.
Oh,
And that
cool.
is essentially my entire thrust. And
Yeah.
the way that I've kind of heard people talk about academia and these higher level degrees is that you have this like circle which is the extent of human knowledge, and you're putting just the tiniest little bump outward a
Yeah.
little bit more. And collectively we do this, and then you have these like big events like Einstein and Turing
Mm,
and etc. But
yeah.
for the most of us, we're just adding just these little bumps to extend that circle just a little bit.
Yeah. So my wife is a scientist as well, and so she sometimes laments that like back in the day it was a little bit easier to make those bumps bumps in the circle, and like these days, yeah, you have to kind of get down to studying specifically the geometry of leaves, leaves and the shapes of
Right.
them. Yeah, yeah. You probably weren't the only one, or I guess are you the only one that's studied that?
Conferences that were focused on this topic are, like 50 people. So
Yeah,
like
yeah,
it's a small group of people focused on this very narrow subset. But of course, it's an onion, right? So you peel back and you get these like bigger ideas that are the
hmm
underpinnings of that idea,
yes.
and you peel that back and you get,
hmm The idea sort of for this conversation came about in my head of just like, you know, I know that dice are like random, right? And I'm gonna the first question I'll ask you in a little bit is like, what is random, right? Like, so the idea is that you have dice and we use them in games to like decide stuff when we want sort of a random number generated. And I know I've seen like the curves that people will draw out about like, if you roll this combination of dice a certain number of times, right? Like these are the numbers you can expect and stuff like that. So, but what I wanted to ask you is, so first of all, you could answer what is random, but then like, what is the easy way for sort of determining those curves? Like, is there just like an equation that people follow, or do I have to sit there and roll a d6 1,000 times and make it myself? Like what's sort of the math answer?
Yeah, so I'll start with, what is random? And there's a lot of philosophical ideas here about randomness that I won't necessarily broach because I am definitely not the right person to broach those. But my kind of working definition of randomness is any process, like rolling dice,
Hmm.
where the individual outcomes are indeterminable ahead of time.
Okay.
However, the long-term dynamics, or the large sample size dynamics are well understood or interpretable.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is for any dice roll, let's take a d6 classic cube. Anytime I roll the dice, I have no idea what the outcome will be.
Hmm.
I mean, I have some idea. It's 1 through 6,
Yeah.
and it's an integer,
Yeah.
but I couldn't say for certain that, it will be a 6, it will be a 4.
Yeah.
However, what I can say for certain is that if you roll that infinitely many times, I will get a 6 1/6 of the time.
Hmm. Okay.
So once you do this enough times, there is some determinism, right? Which says like, yes, 1/6 of the time I will get a 6 if I do this enough times. Like flipping coins, right? Half the time I will get heads if I flip enough coins.
Okay.
But for
Yeah.
any single coin flip, I can't really say if it will be heads or tails.
Yeah, so that makes sense. So, like, yeah, so you like right, the D6 is sort of like the easy example. I've got one in my hand right now, right? Like, yeah, six sides like that. But if you were to say, like, you start going to pick leaves, like off of trees, for example, right? And started counting all the ridges and stuff on each of those leaves, like we probably know that there's like most leaves will have between whatever 50 and 100 of those, right? Like, so to determine that, you just also pick an infinite number of leaves, and then you'd get that same kind of distribution. Is that the thinking?
The interesting question.
Yeah.
And and surprisingly poignant because my focus is on the undulation of leaves,
Oh, okay. All right. Well, yeah,
which
yeah.
turn out to be a very physical process that depends on lots of things.
Okay.
But for any, say, sufficiently complex process that we don't understand, this is another kind of philosophical interpretation of probability, right? Or
Hmm.
randomness. Events that are so complex that they're just easier to abstract in this random fashion. You could pull infinitely many leaves, count the undulations, and for every bin, right? So this
Hmm.
this leaf had 50, so I will put this leaf in my 50 undulations bin.
Yeah.
This leaf had 75, so I will put it in my 75 undulations bin. And then what you'll see is that the sizes of those bins can vary, but they will kind of achieve a steady state as you pull more and more leaves.
Hmm.
There are some details here that we're
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
wiping under the rug. And so then if you were to pull, any random leaf, it would fall into one of these bins with essentially the probability of the size of that bin at that point. And then you could say things kind of more what would happen on this like larger scale if you pulled hundreds of leaves.
Yeah. Yeah.
But again, for any single leaf, you may not have an idea, right? It's still indeterminable.
Yeah. Okay. So there's sort of like the difference between all the like the possible numbers and sort of the on that infinite scale of like what's likely to happen, right? And then but versus then so like but then if you're just stepping into sort of that probability set and you're just going to pick one, like you have no idea, right? Like what it could be.
Correct.
I think the thing that's like interesting to me is that ties into this is like the concept of like people rolling like luckily, right? Like they're really good at rolling or they're really bad at rolling, right? And so like I mean you would say, and I think most mathematicians would say like, well, that doesn't exist, right? Like that's not possible for someone to be better or worse at rolling a die, assuming they have the mechanics of like, throwing it on the table down correctly, which is something that I struggle with. I seem to like roll it off the table, quite a bit. But yeah, there Brandon, who's been on the podcast a couple of times, on the actual plays that we do once a year. Like they roll terribly, and like it seems almost statistically improbable how poorly Brandon rolls. But my understanding is that like that's not a thing, right?
Yeah, my take on that is that it's untrue. We've only done finitely many rolls, for one thing,
Yeah.
right? So it may be the case that he's fallen into a place where he has statistically less likely than average dice rolls. But as time goes on, he should converge to something that's generally on the mean.
Hmm.
However, I think it's more of a confirmation bias psychology problem where
Hmm.
perhaps their initial rolls were maybe not very good. They led to really interesting storytelling.
Mm,
And then anytime they roll well, it kind of passes unnoticed.
yeah.
And when poor rolling happens, it's this like, oh, Brandon, you did it
Yeah.
again. And it kind of like
Yeah.
reaffirms itself as this psychological bias.
It's like, have you ever played a game in Roll20 or like another VTT? You end up in those, right? So if you use their digital dice rolling, right, it gives you like a list of all the dice rolls, like just in the sidebar, right? So every time anyone is rolling, it's telling you exactly what they've rolled. The thing that I've noticed is every time I play in a VTT is that there's a tendency for people to feel like they're rolling really lowly, like really low every time. And I do wonder if it is that confirmation bias of like you're seeing the list of all the all the dice rolls,
Mm.
and because it is in theory more random, in theory it's as random as we can get, right? Because it's a computer and we can have various inputs to try to make it as random as possible and stuff, right? Like, but it seems lower. But I think like with that ephemeral nature of dice rolls at the table, you sort of very quickly forget like what happened last time because you're very much focused on the like, yeah, like you were saying, like the narrative behind it.
Mhm.
Yeah, there's like that meta narrative on top of the story that you're telling together.
Yeah.
Okay, so like going back a little bit to like a more math question. So like, it's like the 1d6, right? Like that makes sense to me, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, like that. If you did something like 3d8 plus 2, is there an equation for figuring out like how those bins will end up happening? Or yeah, like do you graph it out? Like what's sort of the process that a mathematician would go through to figure some of those things out?
Yeah, so there are formal structures for
Hmm.
writing down the expectation or the means or the probabilities, the probability mass function, people would call it, in the case of discrete systems. Discrete being like a 1, 2, 3, rather than like any number between 0 and 1. However, I think the best way to do things like D&D dice or these like small pools of dice is to just write out all the outcomes.
Mm.
Here's kind of the process. So you would say the first die can be a 1, the second die could be a 1, and the third die could be a 1. That represents a triplet, and then you have a value. So 3d6 plus 2, in that case, is 5.
So you're never going to roll lower than 5.
You can't roll lower than a 5. And now you have one entry in your 5 bin.
Okay.
And now you go through all the possible permutations of the dice. So 111, 112, that gives you a 6 in total. And then you would put that in your 6 bin. And then, of course, 121. So you have to keep the dice ordered, right? Roll the first die, roll the second die, roll the
Hmm.
third die. So 112, 121, and 211 all give you the same value,
Hmm.
which is 6. It's the only way to get 6. Those are all 3 possibilities to get 6.
Yeah.
And so you have one way to get 5 and 3 ways to get 6. That
Okay.
means you are 3 times more likely to get a 6 than you are to get a 5.
Interesting. Okay.
And so now you can play this game for all the possible permutations, and those graphs that you see are ostensibly just counting the values in those bins. And so what you'll see is, for values, say 7, 8, and 9, there are a lot of possibilities that give you 7, 8, and 9 on 3d6. So you'll have a lot more entries in those bins or value in those bins. So those will be the most likely. And that's how you get something like one of those bell curves that people are familiar.
Yeah, it also, I mean, this also then kind of brings up for me, it's like, it's like, so we're assuming a perfectly balanced die, right? Like, so people will do the saltwater test if you've heard of that, right? Like, so you make a very salty salty water solution, put your die in, and kind of keep on like bobbing it underneath the surface and make sure that it keeps on coming up with different numbers every time. And if you start seeing the same number coming up, like that's, you can kind of tell like, hey, this die is not balanced, right? I think there's an element of that. Like, so I have these D6s on my table right now that I got from the dollar store, which this is a pro tip. If you're ever looking for really cheap D6s, go to the dollar store. They sell them as like poker dice, in 6 packs and stuff. Yeah, but like these things are for sure not balanced.
Absolutely
Like
not.
like absolutely not. Like there's zero quality control. Like I'm sure I've gotten some that weren't painted, like all that sort of stuff. But I mean, it's kind of fascinating to think about, like, you have sort of the idealized curve, and then you have the curve as it exists with the dice that you're using could be different between two people at the same table. And then you also have sort of like the meta narrative that you're telling at the table about like who's rolling well and who's rolling poorly. And then like on top of that, then you even have like the GM level of like, did they call for a check when they should have versus not?
Plus, you have Brandon who has loaded dice, but they're
Yes.
loaded in the wrong direction.
Yes, yeah. Yeah. Or you have people like fudging rolls and stuff like that, right? So it's like all these things that go into it, like, right? So like we have this concept in tabletop games of like, we have found this way to simulate randomness in a perfect way, but there's all this like fuzzy humanness that gets involved in it too, right? Because it's like, oh well, I'm so cheap, I only get my dice at Dollar Tree. Like that's only dice that I'm going to use. Like that, maybe I argued with the GM enough and they're like, no, actually you're going to take disadvantage on this roll, right? Like, so it's like all this stuff that goes into it. Yeah, so I guess my question for you is like, maybe we can get a little bit into the philosophical. It's like what's the point of dice, right? Like what's the point of having randomness in games? Like I have my own thoughts on that, which I can share in a bit, but I'm curious what yours are.
Let me like go back and we'll build because that
Yeah,
was a
yeah,
lot.
yeah. Sorry.
No, it's perfect. As far as the salt test and like whether your dice are fair or not, which would
Hmm.
be the way a probabilist would talk about your dice,
Yeah.
uh, is not important at all.
Okay.
So even loaded dice will not roll sixes every time.
Yes.
Okay. Unless they're, of course, Bender's dice, which
Hmm.
are different. And he takes the randomness out of it by interpreting all of the physics and like
Uh-huh.
mastering the throw and all of
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And there is some like I think throw mastery that goes into rolling loaded dice. You know, you
Hmm.
kind of like the equivalent of a deck of cards, a mechanic
Yes.
of a deck of cards. That being said, the dice that you're getting at the dollar store or the dice that you get from someone on Etsy who poured them out of resin
Hmm.
or that you get from the casinos for our purposes are effectively equivalent because of I think all of these psychological pieces that we put on top and we're also not in the business of rolling hundreds of thousands of dice a day and eking out little margins like
Mm,
casinos are where
yeah.
if the dice, there you are really talking about the law of large numbers.
Yeah.
But for us, it's just fun, right? And I
Yeah.
wouldn't
Yeah.
worry. And if you're salt testing your dice, you're focused on the wrong part of the hobby. Then, to get to the importance of randomness, I think that's a really complicated question that I also don't know.
Hmm.
That's more about the psychology of storytelling and that I don't know much about. But I've played a bunch of games, so I have
Yeah.
some context, I guess.
Yeah.
Um, and I guess my take would be that if we just got to tell the story that we wanted to tell, then it probably wouldn't be as interesting because we don't have these constraints. I kind of vision it as a constraints problem. And I think this is one of two facets. Constraints really like bolster creativity, I
Yes.
think.
Yeah. Yep.
And
I
so
agree.
when you have a situation where it didn't go as planned and now you're faced with this circumstance that's kind of boxed you into a corner, you have to get creative about how you solve your problem. I think this is true, outside of tabletop role-playing games, and it's also true in the context of any kind of problems you're trying to solve.
Hmm.
If it's kind of like the white paper problem, right? You're like,
Yeah.
I have
Yeah.
this white paper. How do I even start? And but if you're like, I'm boxed in some way, then it kind of sparks that creativity, which I think is maybe really what we're all trying to get at, anyways.
Hmm.
Just I know for me, it's a really important outlet to do those things that are hyper creative and very different than I do in my day to day.
I think what I find often with new players, and especially like myself, I'm not like myself when I was first getting into the hobby and stuff, is I think there's a tendency to try to treat everything as if it needs plot armor. If that makes sense, like you're like, yeah, like, well, I don't want to overcommit because I don't want to lose this character. And I think the further you get into the hobby, or maybe it's just the sort of style of games that like people tend to play who are who are connected to Roll for Topic, it's there is like a tendency of like I want those moments where I'm caught flat-footed. Like I want those moments where I'm put in danger because like there's something that we see that happens that's really interesting in those moments. Like right, like what you were saying, it's like all of a sudden you're faced with this decision that's sort of taken out of your hands a bit. It's like, oh, like, but I want this one thing to happen, but like, there's been a call for a roll, and like, so now we're going to cede control over to this random number generator, right? Right, and like that random number generator is going to match up with the mechanics of the game and sort of tell us what's going to happen, even if we don't like the outcome or want the outcome or anything like that. And I think there's like it is like exactly what you're saying. Like there's such like a creativity that can come out of those moments of like you roll, it goes poorly, right? Like like it goes poorly. All of a sudden you're put in danger, and it's like, yeah, like, well, how am I going to get out of this? How am I going to react to this? How am I going to play my character in this situation? All these interesting things happen when we sort of allow ourselves to like, yeah, step back, let go of control, roll the dice, and sort of see what happens. For me, it's so fascinating because it's like if you tell people that don't play tabletop games about it, like like they're like, oh, like you tell them like how I'm going to play D&D. What they think about is like, oh, you're going to roll a bunch of dice. Like that sounds really dumb. Like why? Why are you doing that? Like yeah, or like I don't get it. That seems like there's a lot of math involved. Like this is really complicated and stuff. And then you play and you're like, it's not complicated. It's just like we've sort of decided collectively that this is a good way to tell stories together, right? Like this is a good way to have fun.
Yeah, I think there's another aspect too that I want to hit on, which I think you're kind of brushing up against, which is kind of the Indiana Jones effect, right? So we don't get those really exciting, the tension building and then kind of the resolution of the temple,
Hmm.
or I think that kind of iconic fight scene with the plane and all of the
Yeah.
hijinks that happen. I mean, those are failed dice rolls for Indiana Jones. He
Oh
fails
yeah.
so many dice rolls,
Yeah.
and we love watching that story. But eventually, the randomness will fall in our favor, right?
Hmm.
So even if you have a few of these failures that are like ratcheting up the intensity or the peril or the this or the that, like the random number generator is hopefully random,
Hmm.
and as a consequence, it will come in your favor eventually.
Yeah.
And that is a nice point to say, like, oh, I've like propelled my character out of this hazard. I've done it in a very interesting way because the hazard was significant as a
Hmm.
consequence of all these, potentially failed dice rolls ahead of time. And I think there is kind of that psychology piece too, which is this tension building device.
Oh yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah. Yeah, it does provide tension because I think like again going back to like sort of human psychology, I think our natural inclination is always going to be ratchet down the tension, right? Like, but if you have an external force that you're relying on to like add that tension, it's harder to negotiate with it, I guess, right? Especially if you're playing a game with a GM, you have to negotiate through the GM. Like it's almost like you're presenting your case of like, well, look, I know the dice are saying this one thing. I know we've agreed we're playing this game. I know you're trying to tell this story, but please don't kill my character off. Right? Like, in I haven't really played with an antagonistic GM ever before. I'm sure there are some that would just say like, no, the dice have spoken. We can't we can't do anything about it. But
I think in some ways there's another piece of advice here for GMs that we should touch on,
hmm.
which is that not all moments need to bring tension.
Hmm.
And so, for example, the only doors in campaigns that bring tension are the doors that are generated as a consequence of the Roll for Topic podcast.
Yeah.
All other doors, like if there's no need for tension, or the storytelling is interesting, like just let them open the door, let
Yeah.
them do the cool thing, let them pick the lock, and like
Yeah.
we don't need to like somehow get stumped behind a door. It's not really that interesting
Yeah.
from a storytelling perspective unless there are external things happening. So if you do, put, a dice gate in front of your door, make sure that there's, marauders that are coming up behind the players, or something
Hmm.
else interesting that's keeping them from safety.
The rules for Mouse Ritter mention something along these lines. I don't have it handy, so I'll try to paraphrase. It's essentially like the philosophy is like whenever you're calling for a dice roll, like it should be sort of a big deal, at least in that game. And I know there's a number of games like this. I think like Blades is similar in that like it's almost like you can have a successful session of some of these games where the dice rolls are pretty limited, like versus D&D where you might hit a combat encounter and then all you're doing for the rest of the night is sort of rolling dice in various ways, like maneuvering and stuff. But like sometimes these games, like I think the recognition in some of these like more narrative focused games is that every time you go back to that random number generator, it is introducing enough chance and enough, I don't know, tension and conflict and stuff like that into the game that you should be very careful about when you introduce those. So it's not that, like you were saying, it's not like every door has to have a series of 15 dice rolls 15 dice rolls behind it. It's like, yeah, like make sure that you're sort of measuring those out throughout the game. And like I think this is maybe like a maturity thing for a GM. Like I know at least when I first started running games, I would call for dice rolls a lot more than right. It's just like it's sort of less interesting.
Yeah, and the written modules that you would get as an early GM, particularly for D&D, everything has a dice roll associated with it.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
tells you what the DC of getting through the door is, so you
Yeah.
therefore feel compelled to call
Yeah.
for a dice roll. So yeah, I don't think that's surprising at all. And you eventually have to come to the conclusion or listen to enough podcasts or play enough games to go like, oh, maybe I don't need that dice roll, and I can actually we can get through those pieces to get to something that's more climactic.
So just shifting gears a little bit, like thinking about Blades in the Dark. So like powered by the apocalypse games and stuff like this have these it's not just pass fail rolls, right? Like the idea is that you have ranges where it's like, you do have outright failure, in them, but usually it's like failure with a consequence that can kind of shift the story around. So like you might succeed with a consequence, or you might fail with a consequence, right? So like those are sort of your three states. So like in blades in particular, right? Like so you're rolling 1d6, 2d6, 3d6, right? Based on sort of your abilities and taking the highest number. Like the highest number for those, and that sort of determines where you fall. And I think what I found playing blades in particular is like it's almost a little bit of a letdown when you succeed. Like when you have a successful roll. It's like that sweet spot of success with failure, like success with like a consequence is like so fascinating to me, because it's like, going back to the well, we've asked the we've asked the dice, what we should do in this situation, and then all of a sudden, like, it hasn't gone our way, and like now we're getting to both get what we want, but also we're shifting the story too, to the point where it's like you really want to see that that mixed success happen.
We'll have to tune your dice pool that you get to
Mm,
make that kind of
yeah.
the mean, right? So that's the
Yes.
most expected outcome. If you
Yeah.
roll, 3 dice, or I don't know the exact, uh, but of course in that system, like the more dice you roll, the more likely you are to get a full success.
Yeah, which is it's interesting. So like I played in a campaign of Blades where one of the players, Mark French, who's been on this was on this podcast really early on in the run. He quickly grasped that like getting as many dice as possible for like sort of your key actions that you wanted to take would mathematically result in more successes. And like I am not a min maxer when it comes to games at all. Like this will be no surprise to anyone who's listening to this podcast, but I'm often like, oh, that's really, you can do that. Okay, cool. But like me, playing Blades, it took me a long time to realize that adding even like, 1d6 to your dice pool, like, can just massively increase your success rate. And kind of that goes back to what you were saying with like how you would determine the curve of what you can roll. It's like if you add another d6, it's like, yeah, your sort of your lowest possible roll is going to be 3, and you have another chance at getting a 6 right away. What's interesting to me is like, yeah, it's like that you can really feel yourself increasing in power in those games as you're leveling up and adding those d6s to it. But again, for me, right, it sort of like also detracts a bit from the narrative fun of the game.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
remember very early on when I started playing D&D, I built the min-max paladin warlock whatever build and
Hmm.
went to a session that was supposed to be a little bit climactic, and we were facing a vampire or something, and I just one-shot this vampire
Yeah. Yeah.
and realized, like, wow, I ruined everyone's fun.
Yeah.
Like the GM was upset, not, they
Yeah.
they took it in grace and like continued the story on, but like, yeah, nobody else really had the spotlight moments in this battle, and I
Hmm.
think the GM had spent a lot of time preparing it, and yeah, that was like the moment for me where I was like, oh, I'm doing this wrong. It's
Yeah.
not about winning. Like that is not that is not the win condition of this game.
Which is weird, because I mean the game presents it as the win condition of like, yeah, you want to be, powerful hero who can one shot a vampire, right? Like that should be the end goal of every game, right? But yeah, there's something I think about, like, yeah, about not being able to fulfill the destiny of the dice
Mhm.
that is like, yeah, just really compelling. I don't know. Maybe we should wrap it up there. I think this has been a really good conversation. I guess, did you have anything else that you wanted to say about dice in general?
I do have kind of an interesting interpretation maybe of the blades dice,
Oh, okay. Yeah,
and
go for
dice
it.
pools, and
Yeah.
and this might get a little fancy, but I do think
That's
it's
okay.
interesting.
Yeah.
And I'll try and do my best to describe it in a nice way, because it's a very different system than roll a d20 and add 6 or add
Mhm.
5. It
Mhm.
doesn't have quite the same kind of like linear effect of success, right? Like every time I add 1, it's just like much more likely, right? Because you're rolling a
Yeah.
single die, each outcome is the same, right? So
Mhm.
you have the 5% probability of getting a 1 and a 5% probability of getting a 2, and all of the dice are the same. So when you add modifiers, it just is kind of like a linear progression in your success rate. With blades, it's a little bit different, because every time you add a d6 and your goal is to get a 6, it scales a lot differently. So if there's, of course, 1d6, then you have a 1 in 6 chance.
Hmm.
And the way I would I'm going to build up a visual strategy
Okay.
here,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, where, you have a line and it has 6 bins in it, right? And the only success is this last bin, right? The 6th bin. Great. Okay, now let's roll 2 dice. Well, instead of a line, now you have this matrix or this like 2-dimensional grid where the first die is a 1 and the second die is a 3 or something like this.
Hmm.
And so now you have a square, and the successes become the bottom row and the farthest column.
Okay.
Okay. And the relative areas of that correlate to your success.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Right. So in 2d6, you have 11 out of 36 possibilities are successes because there's, 6 bins down the column, and then you have the bottom row, which is also 6, but you don't want to double count the far. So
Yeah.
that's, 6 plus 5, which is different than, say 1 over 6 plus 1 over 6. Much different.
Yeah.
Okay, so there you have that, right? And now you can keep playing this game. So
Mhm.
you can say, okay, what happens when I have 3d6? Well, now you go from a line to a 2-dimensional grid to a 3-dimensional grid,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
And your successes now are represented by the bottom, like on a d6, right? It would be the bottom face and 2 of the other faces,
Okay. Yeah.
okay? And now it's getting like more complicated, right? So like there's just more counting to do. However, there's a really interesting kind of theorem or idea that people have shown, which is that the volume of a shape like this actually is all on the outside surface of this object as the dimension goes up and up.
Okay.
Okay, it
Yeah.
gets weird,
Yeah.
but so for example, the way that people would generally talk about this is with a sphere, and so there's a much higher fraction of the volume of the sphere very near the surface, the higher the dimension goes.
Okay.
So this is one way to interpret how the dice, like adding dice, makes for more success, because the success is always on those outside pieces of the sphere, and
Hmm.
that's gaining more and more area. How does that affect the way we play?
Hmm.
I don't know, but
Yeah.
it's an interesting idea,
Yeah.
and it kind of corresponds to some of these fun ideas
Yeah.
from math about concentration of volume, which play these really kind of unintuitive, or they have these really unintuitive consequences as the dimension goes up or as the number of dice you roll go up, right? Because to
Yeah.
say like the volume of a sphere is concentrated on the outside of the sphere, like for us that doesn't really, us in 3 dimensions, that doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense. Like, oh, the volume of the sphere, it's the same wherever you go. But it's this question as when you get 6 and 7 and 8 dice, right, where it becomes more relevant. And we
Yeah.
intuitively know this because, the more dice we have, the more likely we are to roll a 6, right?
Yeah. That is really fascinating. The more dice we have, right, we'll more likely to roll a six. It's like, so if you had 66, going back to like the first sort of discussion we were having about randomness on a d6, right? Like you expect if you roll the dice, you have a 1 in 6 chance if you roll one die to roll a six. So if you roll it 6 times, you'd expect to get 1 6. But if you roll 66, I mean, your expectation is, well, surely one of them will be a six.
Right,
Right? But like it's not going to happen every time.
right.
Um yeah, and I think that's where like I'm glad you talked about this, because it's like, yeah, that's where like the intuition for me sort of breaks down. I think it's like,
Mm-hmm,
yeah, like, like mathematically, like, yes, like I have a very good chance of this happening,
mm-hmm,
but like what is that chance? And like what does that really like change about how I'm going to approach this? Like
mm-hmm.
all of those questions too. Because it's like you can't get out your hypercube, right, when you're rolling
Right.
46 and like, like, oh, let me just calculate the volume and like we'll get back to this real quick. Yeah, but it's
But
just like,
and
yeah.
and a really important thing to note here is like if you're considering probabilities that much, you're
Hmm.
also playing a different game
Yeah.
than maybe the rest of the players at the table.
Oh,
Um,
yes. Yeah.
so you know, do the things that your character is
Yeah.
good at, and if you succeed, then awesome, have a good
Yeah.
time. And if you fail, then awesome and have a better time.
Yes. Yeah. All right. Well, that is as good a place as any to wrap up. Yeah. Thanks again, Toby. I really appreciate this conversation. I hope you liked it. It wasn't too dumbed down for you or anything like that. But
No,
yeah,
absolutely. It's so fun to talk about these ideas because they're,
yeah,
yeah, in some ways very unintuitive, but they
yeah.
do have these nice like physical or like, I mean, I think in geometric shapes, so they
Hmm.
have these nice geometric interpretations, which I
Yes.
also just like to roll around in my head for practice and fun.
Yeah, it's like it's not just theory, right? It's like, yeah, you have sort of the model, but then you can also sort of see how it'll work a lot of ways. But yeah, all right. Well, so that's been good. Yeah, I think, let's see. So next time we record, Andy will be back in the saddle with us. He was out doing some family stuff today. Yeah, so again, thanks Toby for jumping on just to talk to me about this. Yeah, I think that about does it. You can listen to our sister show, The Splat Book, thesplatbook.com. That's with Kyle Latino and John Corey. It is one of my favorite podcasts. They recently had an episode where I think actually Andy was on along with, I think, Matt Wilson as well, to talk about some John Carpenter movies. Which I need to go back and listen to that episode. But first, before that, I need to watch The Thing, which I've never seen The Thing, and I feel sheepish about admitting that on air.
We need to
Um,
get Kyle on to talk about this too, because I think
yeah.
he brings a fun. He,
Oh,
he loves random resolution
yes.
mechanics, and so
Yeah.
he has strong feelings about them from a storytelling and
Hmm.
from an art perspective. That would be
Yes.
really fascinating to hear.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that with him. I've talked about that in person with him before too. It's yeah, especially I think just like how he sometimes incorporates that into his art practice too. Like there's, yeah, lots of lots of really compelling and good stuff there. Yeah, so I mean, this is surely not the last time we'll talk about dice and randomness on the Roll for Topic podcast, but yeah. Yeah, so I think that about does it for us. Again, I've been Chris Salzman. Thanks again, Toby. And remember, if your players are having fun, you're a great GM.